So Shinique Smith was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and now lives and works in upstate New York. She received both her BFA and MFA from the Maryland Art Institute, College of Art, and an MAT from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Her work is inspired by the vast nature of, quote, things, unquote, that we consume and discard, which resonate on a personal and social scale. The graffiti of her youth, Japanese calligraphy, and abstraction are influences from which she extracts the graceful and spiritual qualities in written word and the everyday. Now, here's just a basic list of the prestigious venues where Shinique's work has been exhibited: the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, which I didn't tell you last night. I was out there and saw your fabulous piece at the Denver Art Museum recently. The Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the New Museum, MoMA, PS1, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and in the past few years, she's had solo exhibitions at the Broad in Lansing, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in Los Angeles, and the Frist Center of Nashville, Tennessee, where an exhibition just recently came down, and that was actually a survey. Next month, she is having solo exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville, Florida, and her work has been included in Half the World Abstract Sculpture by Women, 1947 to 2016 at Hauser, Wirth, and Schimmel in LA. And there is so much more, and it is a great pleasure on behalf of Cranbrook Painting to welcome Shinique Smith here at Cranbrook. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? I'm so grateful for being here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Everyone's so welcoming, and to be honest, I've been really working very hard, so I might be a little out of it because I've been juggling a lot of things, a lot of projects. I think Bev is trying to instill time management skills around here. And I'm really still bad at that. No matter how hard I try to spread things out and schedule myself, they all collide and converge. And maybe that's good for me because sometimes that lack of time takes away the room for doubt. So, wait, is this going on its own?
I hope not. Do you want it to go on its own?
No, it kind of moved ahead from where. So this is my studio where I just came from. It's way too small for me to be producing the work that I am right now. I'm working on multiple things at the same time. I'm just starting from where I am right this second, because when I get home tomorrow night, I'm going to be in there trying to finish this piece that is growing and growing. And here. Yeah, this is where it is now. And it was born of a very basic idea, which you'll see from my earlier work. So this is a large-scale installation I'm working on for a show next month. It's getting picked up this month. It was going to get picked up Monday, but luckily, I have a little more time. At any rate, this is right now. And this is all hand-bound, sometimes stuffed with pillows, clothing, fabric, sometimes with ribbon, rope. I'm pushing myself, my scale, and my body right now to produce for me, this is the most monumental sculpture that I've made to date, and I'm still finishing it. And it'll be finished in the space. This is for this Hauser and Wirth show, which, by the way, the name changed. It's no longer called Half the World. It's a revolution in the making now. But I encourage you to check it out because I'm honored to be in it because of all the women sculptors that I'm having the privilege to show with. So these opportunities, they come and they go, and they come in waves. And you have to kind of, for me, I have to rise to the occasion, regardless of time constraints and space. So this is like a little sketch for it, because I didn't study sculpture. I don't know how to make sculpture. I'm kind of not. I'm making these objects that I tie together. And this particular piece started with this necklacey thing that I made that was not realized. It was dissatisfying after I made it. I was looking at adornment and the way necklaces hung on ancient sculptures, the way they hang on a Jean-Paul Gaultier model, things like that. And it just didn't work out. So now you've seen where it's going. This is where it started. And this is where I've started. That's me on the left. Little me. I grew up in Baltimore in a place called Edmondson Village. It's kind of West Baltimore. Just west of the city. It's affectionately called the Village. It's a neighborhood that has transitioned over time from an affluent Jewish neighborhood with the first mall in Baltimore to now, if you've ever seen The Wire, a more drug-addled, crumbling neighborhood with still good people trying to live among these situations. So I grew up in the 70s, kind of not when that was happening, in between, and in a row house. And my mom was young. She's a single mom, so we lived with my grandparents. And this was the backyard on the right that I was talking earlier with Sun Young. Am I saying your name right? Is he here? About patches of grass and how important they are. And my granddad, who hadn't had past like an 8th grade education, he could grow anything. And he grew like corn and all kinds of stuff. He's from the South, in this little patch of green in the hood. And I would sit out there on what I thought was a giant boulder, but really, when you go back, it was like a little block of like leftover cement. And I would kind of meditate and fantasize. So in the beginning, my first influences were Erte, because my mom studied fashion design, and he became a mentor of hers when she went to school at FIT in Paris. And my first memories of making art as a child, other than coloring, was trying to copy him, tracing him, copying him. And she would always impress upon me that when she would watch him work, he would just start and finish, sometimes without drawing. And so the idea of getting things right the first time was like kind of somewhere in the back of my mind. And that's Keith Haring on Bill T. Jones's Body, which when I was a kid, I studied dance. And so this piece to me is kind of everything. On the left is one of my mom's designs. So they were like sculptural, and fabric was always around. And I was being dragged in and out of fabric stores against my will. Thrift stores and vintage clothing and stuff. Like, I hated the smell. I was always like, but then I was always surrounded by fashion, and she was later an editor at a fashion magazine locally. And on the right is a vintage Vivienne Westwood, which I put in because the shape, also the gesture, the body, and how that reminded me of one of the Erte graphics. I'm going to skip ahead a little faster. That's Antonio, who's a fashion illustrator, but he also illustrated 1001 Nights that my mom gave to me when I was little. So storybook illustrations, kind of other realms, fabric, collage. Romare Bearden, my grandma, it was like the only artist that made sense to her. And there are a lot of those works in the Baltimore Museum. So when I went to high school for the arts, my mom encouraged me to go to the School for the Arts, and I had a very traditional education. You couldn't draw. You couldn't paint unless you could draw. You had to know how to render light, perspective, those things. I can't tell you how many cups I've drawn, since the time I was 13 through, then undergrad. So I've recently, I'm always looking back and reflecting on what may have influenced what I'm doing now. And I used to, copy Da Vinci and Durer and, for assignments, drapery. So the fashion and the drapery and the collage and all these little bits, and then the graffiti of my youth. When I was in high school, my then high school boyfriend, who's still my friend, but he wrote graffiti, and on the left, up and down, are some of his works. And these are people I grew up with. And their hand in line in that era of graffiti, in that region of graffiti, where things kind of leaned to the left and there was a flourish. I started writing graffiti, subsequently got kicked out of high school. But that's a whole nother story. Bev knows. So I got kicked out of high school in a roundabout way, got out of high school early, and ended up with a scholarship to Maryland Institute when I was 16. And I was working figuratively. Even though graffiti was an influence, I wasn't thinking of it as like art. And I had been doing all that drawing. So I was doing these kind of, sometimes spiritual, new agey kind of things for a long time after undergrad. I didn't really want to make art, and I was working in film, and that's a whole nother story. But when I started to turn my attention back towards art as a path, after undergrad, it was like 8 years later when I went for the MAT, and 10 years later when I went for my MFA. And at that time, I had read the book The Bluest Eye, and been thinking, and looking more, like when I grew up, there wasn't a lot of diversity within my education, teaching me about Black artists or other art, identity art. So these were things that I had to research for myself, and through that, there also came an obligation for a moment that that's what I needed to do. It was almost like my duty, but I was also inspired by that book. So I did this series of figures inspired by the book, and in the making of them, this is kind of the progression to this one, realized I was more interested in black paint. And I started this process of separating. And so I separated the figure out, and when I did these kind of organic things were happening that had this line moving through them. This is pre-grad school, just before. I think this is a work on paper. I think I might have applied. I'm showing you guys these because you guys are in school to see. Anyway, but when I went into school, I was looking at the line and just took everything else out. And when I did, the writing came back to me. And it could have been because I had left Baltimore and I had this gap of time between my youth and experiences there, my education there, art in general, like not wanting to pursue it, giving it a rest, that going back there, this could have occurred. And when I did this, writing came out, and at first I tried it with spray paint, and I had taken these courses in Japanese calligraphy, so I started working with brushwork. And I found that there is a connection between graffiti and that kind of calligraphy. The black ink can't be erased, and neither can spray paint, really. There is no backing up. There is a rhythm to it when you put the brush down, when you pick it up, and an assurance that you have to have in the making of it. So I started just writing on everything, including my body and other people's bodies, kind of inspired by that Keith Haring that you saw. And I started doing it on paper and like just trying to see where this went materially, cutting the paper, doing it out, bringing it back to the wall, combining it with different materials, interlacing ribbon, building volume from cut paper. And these were all like kind of ephemeral works. And by now I've moved to the city and I started doing group shows and stuff, and everybody wanted me to do one of these installations, right? So for my first year after school, I made nothing that was concrete. Everything was disposable. I'd take all my stuff there, plus I didn't have any money, so build it and then reconstitute those things into other works. This is one that was at the National Portrait Gallery in an unfortunately titled show called Recognize Hip-Hop Portraiture, which has nothing to do with, I don't understand why I was in the show, but I was glad to be in the show at any rate. And for this piece, I partnered with the poet Nikki Giovanni, and we were the only women in the show, and so she had written a poem, and I translated it. So all the calligraphic mark is text, kind of secretive text. Sometimes you can read it, sometimes you can't. Just like when I was a kid and, there were areas in the city, it was like our playground. This is before the metal detectors and the guns and people shooting each other for tennis shoes and stuff, where we would leave notes, but that only we could read. So at any rate, integrating more materials into it and starting to play with denim and studs, working in fabric. I threw Brooke Shields in there because of the jeans, and that was like my first exposure to jeans meaning something, like other than clothes. It was something that people coveted when I was 12. I had been accosted because some girl hated my jeans in school, and I begged my mom for Calvin Klein's. Anyway, but I started thinking about fabric and its associations as far as what people, different pockets of culture, how denim moves through different pockets of culture, and bandanas and things like that. And I was bleaching denim, which, because the calligraphy is so much my signature, I have tried to find different ways to differentiate it for myself or subvert it. And so I'm kind of jumping around in time with the works. I'm using fabric as a surface, integrating it a little bit, draping it over, concealing things. And then I tried for a minute to paint with it, just, like kind of moving things around. And I liked working with fabric because I hadn't had to invent the color. It was there already. And it had these associations that I was still figuring out with people's different backgrounds and kind of sometimes moral goals in life. Some people shop at thrift stores because they feel it's more moral. Things like that, whatever. Anyway, I could go off on a whole tangent about that. So playing with it in many different ways, and pulling inspiration from the world around me. This is my grandmother's neighbor's socks. The old man that lived next door to her, it must have been his sock day, because that was all that was out there. But there's something kind of, I don't know, something endearing to me about the way that we, it's at the same time endearing, the things that we need, we don't have, things we quest for, and at the same time, it's glut and over-consumption. And so these two things kind of come together in my work, And I hadn't made sculpture before, and I wanted to work with fabric, but had been dissatisfied by it. And one day I just kind of said, screw it, and took a pile of stuff that was in my studio that was meant for other things and tied it up. And it felt very satisfying. It felt like solid. All the things I had been making before that were kind of flimsy or thin or ephemeral. And so I was like, I don't know why this is happening, but I kept on with it and played with color and texture and what I was tying up, and could it exist with the calligraphy. And then one day I said, I want to film myself making one. Like, it's kind of like, I don't know, a narcissistic thing to think of. I'm going to make a film of me making, but like, it's that interesting. And it wasn't at all. And what I realized was that I needed to be within it. And I made this little performance in my studio where I took all my favorite things, and I kind of was naked at the beginning, but all that got stripped away and just for this little bit of gesture that became a dance, the act of me binding myself, which led to bringing the figure back into the work and realizing that one of the things I don't like to do, and we've talked about that with some of the studio visits, is make things out of a sense of obligation. An obligation to push the figure out, an obligation to keep it there. I want to give myself a feeling of discovery as I go, and so I let things come and go and float and move in circles. But when I do, I work each thing to completion. So this piece was never shown. It was a little study in my studio because I was thinking about evictions. And in Baltimore, you would pass sometimes a whole family's things, cast out onto the street. And of course, you're curious, you want to look at what they had, and it's like pictures and stuff. And so that was called pink eviction. But I realized that trying to duplicate that, like trying to remake some homeless person's bundlings or an eviction or anything like that was still kind of depicting something that I didn't want to do. But I really was starting to get into packaging. And tying things up tightly and realizing how the act of doing that had various different relationships that it's equalizing. Each thing is on the same level, Not only that, but all the little things that come from different people come together into one form. And the tying is linear and it's functional too, because it's holding it together. So yeah, this one was I was traveling somewhere and Maury Povich was on the TV, and every time I've seen it, which has only been a few times, it's either been an episode about, is this a man or a woman? Right? Or fat babies. And this episode was about obese children, and I was still thinking about glut and overconsumption at the time, and there was like a 2-year-old eating fried chicken and donuts, sitting in a diaper, and so I wanted to make a fat baby. And I did, and it was huge, and it weighs a lot. But it was such a distraction, all the elements, because of its shape and maybe what I used. So this was a moment where I wanted to negate everything, and I painted it white. And all the details were stripped away. And then I brought the details back by painting it gold. And I became kind of enamored with it for a minute. And I've only made 2 sculptures, luckily, or 3 that are gold. But for a minute, I thought everything was going to be better if I painted it gold. It was like having the Midas touch. And some things, they develop quickly, and some things don't. This particular piece, I had made this bundled speaker, like on an old stereo speaker that I found and painted it gold and stuff, and it sat in my studio for 3 years. And then another artist gifted me this empty skin of a giant lion stuffed animal, and they just seem to go together. So the personal comes in to the mix. All the stuff a lot of things come from me or my friends. This particular piece came from an ex-boyfriend. We lived together, and when he moved out, he didn't want to come get his stuff. And he was like, oh, well, you could make art out of it. It was a friendly party. So I did. Because I recognized that the little pile of stuff must have been his stripe period that he wanted to leave behind. And for some reason, he had an inordinate amount of socks and jars of change, and it became this kind of shrine. When I look back on this piece, though, I feel like this part is the part that I'm most attracted to. Sometimes in the making, or some time in my path, I started thinking about place. Maybe partly because of the nomadic kind of nature of the work and drawing inspiration from, the aesthetics of homelessness. Maybe it was going also to New Orleans after Katrina. But at first I was making these bundles and giving them a little carpet, like its own little place in the world. And I think that I started to reflect on that more. And this is a thing that comes and goes in the work, an allusion to a place or a room, especially like a teenage bedroom, the place where you hide your secrets and put up every little bit of your identity. This is a piece I made after being in New Orleans. So that led me to make this work called No Dust, No Stain. It was an installation in a market, the Essex Street Market, and people were invited to come in, take off their shoes, write on the wall. And I found that when people were writing on the wall, they were writing wishes and actually using the space. It was a little gallery that the art world didn't really go to, but the people who came to use the market did. It smelled like fried food inside. It was a little storefront, so it had this, I used its elements too. There was a bell, and anyway. So this was my first interactive kind of work. And so some things will hearken to my teenage bedroom or someone else's bedroom, like under the bed, and what things might be found there. And I think that I'm still reconciling where the calligraphy and the binding come together. And with the calligraphy, the gesture, which I feel like sometimes it's a kind of a vehicle. It's a vehicle towards making abstraction. Like, I don't feel comfortable just making a gesture unless I'm writing something. But I've been striving to break that up with collage or wiping it away in different processes. I'm still using it because it feels like the most direct way for me to express emotion. And I feel as though, the line of the binding and the line of the calligraphy function in the same way, except one is compressive and one is expulsive. A few years ago, I did a show, and I was doing the show in a space downstairs, a project space at the Studio Museum of Harlem. And I was doing a wall work that was becoming a narrative because of the way that the wall moved. And it was really about my growing up, the elements that were that I was including in it. And upstairs, Barclay Hendricks was showing, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but his earlier paintings of himself, nude, black man, standing, kind of proudly displaying his manhood, was upstairs, And I thought about my relationship to him and his cool aesthetic, and he's older than me, so it was a different era of coolness, and his male prowess. And here I am downstairs with my cool aesthetic of graffiti, kind of skateboard, my teenage life. But the way that I felt most natural in matching that was to use my body in addition to the gesture on the wall. Sorry, picture face. So I did, and it was kind of liberating. I mean, I never, it's funny because I always thought of body prints and that kind of thing as a hippy-dippy endeavor that I would never do. And when I said to the guards that that's what I wanted to do, it became this thing of, let's plan, when are you going to be nude, and all this stuff. But my assistant at the time, I was just like, watch the door, and it would do it, and then they'd come back, and anyway. So this is another element that I've added, and I keep, so I strip things away, and since then I've been bringing things back and giving myself permission to add more, and I feel that the more hybrid I can make things, the stronger it can be, but not all the time. Sometimes it's just too much. At any rate, this is body prints on the wall at the Denver Art Museum a while back. This is another piece that combining objects, this time dipping the objects in the same inks that I put my body in, and kind of doing it at the same time. And at the time I thought about making it a performance because it was in a space that had a glass wall from the street. But I didn't think it would be as interesting for me. Like I didn't want to, maybe I am still concealing things and still realizing what to share and what not to share. I'm still figuring it out as I go. I don't know what I'm doing half the time. But one thing I do know is that the good thing, and whether it will sell or whether anybody will like it, doesn't drive the work. Because that goes back to that sense of obligation, and it's a really hard place to be in because you never know who's going to want something or want to show it or like it or not. And at the end, it's really about whether it's working for the body, my overall. Because at first I was like making things in school, and then I came out and I was making things, trying to, 10 group shows a year, because I don't want to live and die around my work. I want it out there. I feel like it loses energy when it's sitting around. And if it is sitting around, I'll look at it again. Maybe I'm in a different place and I see something that I missed before, and so I'll rework something. Like this particular piece, I would like to rework it. I'll say that right now. It's not all the time I feel that way, but this was, the first time I'm using black ink too for the body prints after this installation, and bringing it onto canvas and taking things from a wall installation onto this space. It's totally different context, and it had a different energy. It was too contained, and I'd like to go back to it. This one I feel more satisfied with. This one is layers of different color body prints, but I'm also using the brush as I'm going. And when I reflect, I think it goes back to Erte and some of the frolicking women. and the way ribbon is whipping around. That's kind of how I imagine myself on the left in the studio. It's not how things are. On the right is Carolee Schneemann. Up to and including her limits, that piece is called. So yeah. This is the piece that was in Lansing. So I'm still on the same path of using the same things that were driving forces, but each time I feel that I'm closer to understanding more. Each time I include things or work space differently. Sorry, I'm getting a little lost about what I was going to say. Should have made notes. At any rate, this piece I made at a time when I was allowing myself to swoon and saying it's okay to make something romantic, overtly girly, pink. And I guess that's the thing. I'm always trying to change things for myself and explore different things. This piece, I was making mandalas, and I was trying to see where geometry, this is more recent, might come in and against the curvilinear marks with using my recycled show cards. Yep. This is a piece that I made in Birmingham for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement. There was this exhibition, and I made it. I was collecting dollhouses. I collect a lot of stuff. Technically, I might be a hoarder a little bit. But I use the things that I have, and they're in a separate room called my studio, or in storage. At any rate, I was collecting dollhouses, and I was told I couldn't anymore because I didn't have room for them. And this show came up, and I wanted to focus more on, my piece was focused on the 4 girls that were killed in the church bombing. And each house was for the girls. And I started thinking again about the bedroom and what the day before might have been like, what records they might have been listening to, and sourcing some materials from that era. And all the materials came from residents of Birmingham. And the form was based off of a Tibetan healing mandala that I had seen made when I was a kid, when the Tibetan monks came to town. And so these are, I feel like I'm always looking back at my youth, and I'm still packaging things, the act of which is violent and loving at the same time. There's an empathy for these objects that are, made elsewhere, shipped back here, and come to me. But so in some way, I'm seeing that there's connections between us all in the work, and there's some kind of little bit of spiritual notion, or maybe imagined for myself, with these objects that link us together. So these are recent explorations. I still don't know where it's going, where I'm cut the wood, the text into wood, kind of inspired by Islamic design and architecture. There's the most recent one. This was in Nashville. That's kind of the interior there. I've been doing public projects of late. This is a mural that's up right now in Aspen. And this is a mural that I made in Boston I think it came down this past September. It's a rotating wall. I think I was the third artist to do the wall. This was during the show that Bev mentioned that I had in Boston, which gave me the opportunity to bring dance back into the work. I studied ballet when I was a kid, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a ballerina. And the kids that I went to School for the Arts with who became dancers, I see them, sometimes in companies, and it's always been there. The body, the act of tying, the gesture that I'm making, there is this dance between chaos and restraint and a lyrical use of material that is influenced by dance. So I started doing collaborations with dancers recently. I have been working too. I don't know if I'd call it performance art per se, but it is an extension of the painting and sculpture, and I'm going to end with the last piece that I made at this mural site. Hopefully it'll that's a still from it. It was just a clip. I thought it was the whole thing. Sorry, guys. It's on Vimeo if you want to see the whole thing. So that's it. I guess I could. Anyway. So yeah, it's another way of working with a figure and making the costumes. When I was in grad school, I did some experiments with sampling my voice and dance. I didn't show those because they're not very